Welcome everybody to this, our second session of the first day of the IPI World Congress. And this next session is really confronting one of the big questions of journalism today. How do we make local media work in the 21st century? And this is a key focus of the Global Journalism Project that IPI launched this year. And so we're delighted to be hosting this conversation in partnership with Report for America, Report for the World, Columbia Journalism School, and Craig Newmark Philanthropies. And in our first worldwide look at local media that we published earlier this year, we found, and no surprise, that local news is the most disrupted sector of the media. It's the most urgently in need of assistance, and the sector also with the greatest potential to form the bedrock for a new, stronger media ecosystem. And the digital transition is the opportunity to build sustainable media that better serves communities through innovation and experimentation. It's already happening, but it's unevenly distributed, particularly outside of North America and Europe. And so now in this session, we have the opportunity to explore what that means as we think locally and act globally. And to moderate this session, I'll hand you over to our friend and colleague from the IPI North American Committee, Charles Sennott, who's also the founder, CEO, and editor of the GroundTruth Project USA. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Jacqui. And I want to really say thanks, Jacqui, for the incredible research you've been leading around local journalism in a global context. And I really have learned a lot from it. And I feel like we just have tremendous shared mission with IPI, where I'm proud to have served on the North American Committee going on, I think I'm past 10 years now. It's such an important organization, and thank you all for being here as part of IPI's World Congress. The GroundTruth Project, I founded it about 9 years ago, and the GroundTruth Project has evolved a lot since we started it, but it's always had a mission, which is to support the next generation of journalists to work in undercovered corners of the world and to do stories that serve those communities. That mission has stayed completely consistent, even though we've evolved a lot. We've created two programs that we're really proud of. One is Report for America, and this is a service program, which I really worked hard on with the co-founder of that, is Steve Waldman. Steve is my colleague who has just become this extraordinary voice in support of local news in America and really put his finger on this crisis early. And we're very proud to have Report for America have its home at the GroundTruth Project. More recently, we took our international work, which we've done all along, and we've forged it into a service program that's called Report for the World. And Report for the World is really taking that same idea that we have with Report for America and saying we need to find a way to create a service model program where we work with local newsrooms to support local reporters in their newsrooms to serve their communities and to really focus in on the specific areas there. And I'm really proud today that we have two just amazingly talented emerging journalists, next generation journalists who are part of GroundTruth's programs. Hibah Ansari is with Report for America, and she's based at Sahan Journal in Minneapolis. And just for those of you who don't know Sahan Journal, it is an amazing digital organization, a great success. And Hibah has a very extraordinary beat. Hibah, I'd just love it if you say hello for a minute. Tell us just a little bit about your beat.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hibah. I'm a reporter at Sahan Journal, as Charlie mentioned. I cover immigration policy, which isn't just about immigration policy. It's really about what's happening at the federal, state, and the city level that's affecting the immigrant communities in Minnesota. And so that sort of spilled over into another area of coverage that I'm working on more so this year, which is local government. Again, big beat, but really narrowing in on how that's affecting the immigrant communities here, particularly Somali, Hmong, and Latino communities, as well as others. Those are kind of the big populations here. And I'm excited to talk to you all about how I've been doing that.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Hibah. And I want to also introduce Vivian Chimay, who is equally just an extraordinary example of the kind of emerging talent we're seeing globally. And really, when I think of people who are the next generation of journalists, I think of Hibah, I think of Vivian, I think of so many of our core members. But Vivian also works with an extraordinary news organization called TheCable in Nigeria, and has a very unique beat that I think is just so critical in Nigeria. So Vivian, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And maybe just tell us for a minute about your beat and what you're covering.
All right, thank you, Charles. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you all about the work that I do. Of course, Charlie already said, my name is Vivian Chimay. I'm from Nigeria, and I report on climate change for TheCable, and an online newspaper in Nigeria. And then I try as much as possible in my bits in climate change to try to relate it to communities in Nigeria, because right now climate change is one of the planetary issues of our time, and everybody's talking about it. So, and it goes to show how journalism is going to be able to bring up some of this, how issue is affecting people on the ground. So yes, I'm excited to talk to you today about all of that.
Thank you very much, Vivian. And you were breaking up a tiny bit there at the end, so we'll keep our eye on that and maybe watch in the chat. If you're breaking up, we'll let you know. But hopefully our signal will hold globally. I hope that's the case. I want to introduce our other panelist, Steve Coll, who is just an extraordinary journalist in his own right and leader, thought leader in journalism today and in the future of journalism. I'm really looking forward to talking with Steve. We're gonna open up with a big picture question for Steve. But before I do, for those of you who don't know Steve, and I'm sure most of you do, so my introduction will be brief compared to the accomplishments. But Steve is the Dean of Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He's also a staff writer at The New Yorker, and truly has an extraordinary experience in covering so many of the issues we'll talk about today from Afghanistan, and I'd like to try to get into that. So that part of the world, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, has been extraordinary focus for Steve's work, particularly early in his career. You know, I started covering what became known as Al-Qaeda, sort of nascent Al-Qaeda, in 1993 after the World Trade Center bombing. And back then, I was reading Steve's work and his work along the Grand Trunk Road and sort of understanding the complexity of this terrain through his work. So I think I've covered it for 28 years, Steve a lot longer, and I'd love to hear sort of the historical context he can bring. A couple of his books that there are almost too many books to name here, but certainly one I want to be sure to highlight is Ghost Wars, which is just an extraordinary journey, really through one of the most important stories of our time, the secret history of the CIA, Afghanistan, and bin Laden, from the Soviet invasion to September 10th, 2001. It frames the history right to the edge of that terrible anniversary 20 years ago, September 11th. The other one is the Bin Ladens, an Arabian family in the American century, which came out in 2008, pulls the story forward. But Steve's work has also been considerable on the issue of climate change. And there are a number of different books he's written on this. The Taking of Getty Oil, which is the story of the most spectacular and catastrophe takeover of all time. And another one that's really interesting is The Private Empire, ExxonMobil and American Power. And I think we're going to hopefully get in discussions of both of those. But Steve, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you. And please, I really want to open this discussion up to the big framing here. And that is to say there's a crisis in local news. And it's a crisis that is occurring globally. So we feel the crisis in local news acutely in America. And I think there really are some through lines to just how divided our country has become. And I think we can talk about those. But what I think might interest our audience here with the International Press Institute is also the ways in which this global crisis is very global in its nature. So Steve, if you could just help us get started here on the landscape of how we understand this moment, this crisis in local news, what it means for the United States, but what it also means globally.
Well, thank you, Charlie. Thanks for that generous introduction. And Hibah, how wonderful to see you. It's been a while since we were in the classroom just before pandemic. Very excited that you're at Sahan, and Vivian, glad to join you as well and listen to you. I think local news, of course, has been disrupted in the industrialized world because it was organized in print through local newspapers, local radio and television, largely around advertising. And the rise of the Silicon Valley giants have so destroyed the advertising market that all of those media locally depended on that they've struggled to continue. In some cases, lots of local newspapers have closed, others are shrinking and under duress, and even local television and radio, which looked more durable, are facing transformations, partly because of the disrupted advertising market and partly because of new technologies. If you travel around the world, you'll see different pictures in different places. In some emerging countries, such as India, which had until recently a relatively unfettered and apolitical and independent press, the local newspaper world of vernacular newspapers is still going pretty strong. It's declining, but it's healthier in some ways than the national media. But we can look at the economics around the world and see similar patterns. Mostly they involve the loss of advertising and the need for new models. And I think we'll get to the question of solutions, but I think, Charlie, your work, Report for America, is an indication of what I see happening, what I think is the case, that really to develop a vibrant, sustainable, democratic, independent local media, we'll have to be pursuing lots of different models at the same time for the foreseeable future. There is no magic bullet. The nonprofit sector that you work in, and that where Hibah is now at Sahan, that's an important part of the solution, partly because it can develop an independent posture at a time of changing and intense commercial pressures. I do think over time, commercially self-sustaining, independent local journalism is going to be really important, because it always has been in democratic societies, and we don't want to be dependent on donors to inform our citizens about important matters of political decision-making, quality of schools, equity, policing at the local level. These are all the important stories of equality and justice of our time, and they happen locally. We need independent reporters holding powerful individuals to account. So I'll stop there, but I think the dilemma that we're all kind of seized by when we have these conversations is, I think, our common understanding certainly in open societies or semi-open societies, however troubled they may be. And the United States is obviously a very troubled society, even as it clings to its ideals of openness, that in these societies, local reporting is the bedrock of democratic participation. It is the means by which it's the court of last resort for people who need to hold powerful people accountable. We saw this in the Me Too movement. The courts that people rely on failed the survivors of sexual assault for an awfully long time, and it was journalism's role that kind of accelerated accountability in a way that wouldn't have happened through the court system. And we can pick out many other examples, including the murder of George Floyd, where Hibah works now. A 17-year-old citizen journalist with a cell phone changed the world, carrying out what we might think of as a journalistic function at the local level. And so, that's what it's all about. It's that kind of engagement in the public square at the local level that we're seeking to preserve. And the mechanics are challenged, but there are solutions emerging, both commercially and in the nonprofit area, I think.
Thanks, Steve. And for the audience, I just want to explain a little bit something Steve touched on that I think is incredibly important. This idea that we're going to have to think through lots of different strategies and business models. And what I love about this panel is that everybody represents sort of all oars in the water approach of different models. At GroundTruth, our service programs, Report for America and Report for the World, it's a pretty basic formula. We say to local news organizations, what do you have in terms of your coverage area? If that's radio, TV, or print, whether you're digital or you're a newspaper, we want to know what in your community needs to be covered that's not being covered. What is a critically important issue to serve your community? And then we at GroundTruth, we want to know how can we help? So we say through Report for America or through Report for the World, we will come in and we will put up half of the salary for a journalist, and we'll do this for up to 2 years. We want to work with those news organizations to think about raising money through the nonprofit sector, or as Steve pointed out, maybe there are commercial ways to increase some of the sponsorship, advertising, or even membership models connected to the service that the journalists we're funding do for the community. So we're very fluid in our business model, but we're really passionately dedicated to expanding the nonprofit role in local newsrooms, both in the United States and globally. So, but you don't have to be a nonprofit in order to partner with us and fund a reporter. So for the editors and publishers who are listening in, I just want to really encourage you, please look at these programs and please think about joining us, applying. We're accepting applications for Report for America right now. We really encourage people. And with Report for the World, we're going to be expanding this fall, soon, later this month. We're going to be announcing a kind of modest expansion, but we're definitely going to try to do more work in different countries. So I just give you that as a framing. But Steve, to circle back to you, I want to get back, just maybe give us in a condensed form, how sort of what you see as the depth of this crisis right now. You gave us this really beautiful, broad framing. And I couldn't agree with you more that it's going to have to be a multiplicity of approaches, nonprofit as well as strengthening commercial. But it feels like the crisis in journalism is becoming this crisis for democracy, that we are seeing that where local journalism fails, democracy fades, truth starts to fade. And yeah. How serious is this crisis? How would you frame it, if you could, nationally and globally?
Well, I think it's very, very serious, and I think it's related to the polarization and the rise of organized propaganda that has affected politics in many parts of the world over the last 4 or 5 years. I think, 3 quick points. The number of professional journalists reporting locally has declined dramatically as a result of the economic disruptions we discussed before. Even with the build back of nonprofit organizations, the net loss of professional reporting is substantial. Secondly, social media has become a significant source of information, even though a lot of users of social media rightly do not trust the information they see there. Nonetheless, it's pervasive, and it has, as we all know, become a platform for disinformation and organized propaganda campaigns. And third, social scientists are starting to see a link between the collapse of local news and a decline in informed civic participation. Political scientists and sociologists now feel like they can measure the effects. And because, for example, the inclination of people to vote is related to their engagement, and their engagement is related to the information they can access and the sense of their own kind of participation in the issues of the day in their community, that there's a negative loop that's starting to take place. So you have both a loss of the public square and journalism's role in it at the local level, and the rise of deliberate organized disinformation at the same time. And, I don't think we can afford to be complacent about where that might lead. Yes, we can all sound hysterical when we warn of the rise of anti-democratic political forces in societies that have seemed to be stable for a long time. But history doesn't sit still, and history tells us that the very thing you think is impossible will often arise out of circumstances where people are polarized and there's not a sense of common ground. So I worry that, obviously I'm not suggesting that the decline of local news has caused the moment that we're in politically, but I do think there is evidence that it is contributing to it, and its revival, the revival of local news, must be part of our response. We must see it in the context of the democratic deficits that we're all wrestling with.
Thanks. That's really great framing. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to shift now to Hibah and to Vivian. And Hibah, I want to start with you and just talk about your work at the Sahan Journal. Tell us a little bit. I mean, there is no community in America that came more dramatically, tragically to represent just how divided our country is. I think, the steps of the Washington Capitol are one example, but the murder of George Floyd, what it caused in that community, your arrival on your beat, I believe it was just literally days after George Floyd was murdered, as the city was starting to really simmer and then boil, and then the country began what I hope will be a true reconciliation, a sort of rethinking around a reckoning, really, of racial injustice in our country. We've got a really long way to go. I don't want to suggest we're well on the way, but tell us a little bit what it feels like there in Minneapolis, in this city, to be covering immigrant communities, really sometimes marginalized communities, but also vibrant communities. How do you balance that, Hibah, in terms of telling those stories that haven't been told well enough? And how do you feel like you're doing in accomplishing that? Give us some examples of your work.
Sure. So just to start, our mission at Sahan Journal, we're the only nonprofit, or perhaps the only newsroom in Minnesota that's dedicated to providing news for and about immigrant communities, as well as communities of color generally in the state. So like I said before, we write about the struggles and the successes of immigrant communities, such as the Somali, Hmong, and Latino communities, among others. And so in doing that, I've kind of noticed that I feel like we're documenting the changing demographics of the state, which is pretty representative of the larger nation too. What's perhaps different though is the stakes have felt a lot higher in the last year, especially. I moved to the Twin Cities just a week after George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police. And it felt like right away, the world was forced to confront racism in every community, every home, and every industry, and media was no exception. So at the time of his killing, Sahan Journal was not even a year old yet, but we were created for that exact moment. We cover communities that experienced intense trauma in a way in which we put their stories and their needs first, not a headline, not a tweet, and not a soundbite. So that's where I come in. As a Muslim myself, as somebody who has immigrant parents, I've grown up with my fair share of media misrepresentation, and I think my sources here, they get that when they see me or when they see my name in their inbox. And that, combined with our reputation as a newsroom, I feel like sources automatically feel like they can trust me. And that's really the golden ticket. When we're talking about a community that, again, has historically been harmed by media, to feel that in a first conversation, in a cold call, trusted is really valuable. And I cherish that fact every day in itself. So from there, when a source trusts you and you cold call them, they're ready to help you. They're ready to answer your questions. And within those first few weeks here, I really felt that. And I think the communities that I covered also, felt that same sense of urgency that the world was feeling. So I want to kind of talk about one example, especially if we're talking about thinking globally, reporting locally. Refugee resettlement, as somebody who covers immigration policy, has been a bulk of my beat. Minnesota has a really long history of accepting refugees into the state, starting, from Hmong refugees coming from Laos and Thailand in the 90s, to Somali refugees, to now refugees from Afghanistan. And I think when we talk about evacuation, refugees, we often talk about it in this really large scale and abstract way. But refugee resettlement happens locally, and it has been for a really long time. So it's not just the responsibility of the state of Minnesota to help, refugees get started. It's a responsibility of the state and even the county. So that's kind of where I come in. I look at what that process is like, who's considered a refugee, where are they coming from, what parts of the state are they settling in, where are they working, what do they need? And again, covering immigration policy, that just became a really big part of my beat in the last year. So, centering their stories then in sort of the classic Sahan style, now the story is not just about, for example, the tens of thousands of people that have fled Afghanistan. It's about the family that just moved into your neighborhood, the person you work with at a meatpacking plant, the person who represents you on a city council seat, or even in our case, Congress. So that depth and that nuance is really at the center of my reporting and in the coverage of Sahan Journal overall. And it's been amazing to have that learning experience so early in my career. So.
Thanks so much, Hibah, and thanks for the, truly exceptional work you're doing. Really, it's inspiring, and I love that your stories are such a mix of looking at the struggles of this community, for sure, of the different immigrant communities for sure, but also their successes. Feels like you go in rhythm almost with the stories, and I think it's really it's exciting to watch. I think it's also very candidly, I think it's a really good business model. I think our country is made up of immigrants, and that Sahan Journal has found a business model in really covering them and being dedicated to them, I think is brilliant. I look forward to getting in a little bit further to that. But I do want to switch over to you, Vivian, and talk about your beat covering climate change in Nigeria, where one of the countries in the world that I would say the climate challenges are very sharp-edged and acute. You have a huge energy industry, but you also have great impact environmentally and economically and even politically, I would say, around the energy sector. And certainly some of the clashes we sometimes see in Nigeria, when they come to the Western media, they're sometimes framed as religious divides. And quite often those have to do with climate change, actually, with scarce resources and with pastoralists being pushed up against farming communities, pastoralists in the north being more Muslim and the farming communities more to the south of the Middle Belt being tending to be predominantly Christian, and the ways in which we fail to understand the big picture. So what I love about your beat, Vivian, is that dedication to the big picture, trying to get at that story with a news organization that is digital first, that sees the future. How are you doing? Tell us about some of the stories you're covering, some of the stories you're thinking about in trying to get your arms around an issue that really defines the whole theme of this panel, which is to think globally and report locally. How do you handle that challenge? And tell us about some of your stories.
Okay, talking about climate change in Nigeria and how it's affecting the people, like you already highlighted, Charlie, there are some of these situations, some of these things that happen in Nigeria and people are not able to make the connection immediately that, oh, this is exactly where the problem is stemming from. So people think, oh, it's religion or it's ethnicity, but there are other underlying factors that actually go to fuel some of these things, like climate change, as you already mentioned. So Nigeria is experiencing climate change at different levels. We have people experiencing, flooding, food insecurity. We have desertification happening in the arid region. We have droughts. We have, the conflict in itself as well. So these are different degrees at which Nigeria is experiencing the issue of climate change. But then people don't really understand that these are, impacts of climate change. They don't really understand that, oh, as it's happening to me here in Nigeria, there's also another place it's happening around the world. There's another community that's facing similar challenges. So that's where my work comes in as a climate change reporter, to try to help people to really make these connections between issues in their communities and in their environment and how it's connected to climate change, which is a global discourse. So if we're talking about health issues, we're trying to relate it to how that could be as a result of, heavy rainfall, precipitation, and how that's affecting their health. And then looking at the conflicts that you're talking about, if we're to look at it in terms of conflict, the northern part of the country is very much arid, and then the southern part where we have good vegetation and pasture. And it's a normal thing in Nigeria to see some of these pastoralists begin to move towards where the land is greener or towards where there's more pasture. So during these seasons, when they move towards the southern part of the region, and that's where you have more Christians. And when they come in contact with some of these communities, people begin to define it as a religious crisis, whereas it is not. It's more like as a result of struggle of resources, and then these resources in themselves are limited. And what's making them become limited is climate change. There's more drought, water is not enough, vegetation is going down. So people are beginning to come in close contact and are struggling for some of these resources. So if we're able to begin to help people to make these connections, they will be able to know, how can we adapt? How can we manage the resources that we have? How can we be able to fight this as together as a country instead of fighting against ourselves? So if you look at how climate change is really affecting Nigeria, I feel it's to really look at the global aspect of it and then report on it locally. So if you talk to somebody in a community in Nigeria to say, oh, the International Panel on Climate Change has said, oh, the world has had like a 1 degree Celsius increase in global temperature, the person does not understand. So I feel it's when you go down to these communities and you begin to talk to people, you see how people are being affected. People, as a few days ago, 3 people died in an estate in Abuja out of flooding. The area became very flooded. People couldn't survive. People's cars were submerged. Houses were submerged. But people wouldn't understand that, oh, we're beginning to experience more rainfall, more flooding as a result of climate change. So that's how I try to balance my report. I try to let people know that if there's an increase in global temperature, this is how it could affect you in the local sense here in Nigeria. And it's not just happening to you in Nigeria, it's happening to someone else in maybe Burundi, it's happening in Vietnam, it's happening in India. And then in my reporting, I try to as well to look at some of these communities and how they try to adapt to some of these changes in their environment, because it also helps to like give ideas to other people in other communities around the world to see how they can look at the challenges they are facing and how other people are tackling that challenge and how they can also localize it in their own environment to be able to address some of these issues. So if you look at the issue of climate change in Nigeria, it's diverse, it's local, but then it's global. And I'm also happy that it's beginning to gain the attention that is needed, because reporters and journalists are beginning to take up, that mandate to like talk about it, go down into community, talk to farmers who are like Nigeria is we have rain-fed agriculture. So farmers are able to like adapt and know, oh, we're not having rain as much as we used to have. March or April, it's moving towards May. Usually we used to have rainfall coming from March. So you get to explain to them and they're able to like adapt and begin to shift their production and cultivation practices towards that time of the year when they will have enough rainfall. So yeah, that's the diverse angles through which I take my reporting, try to balance it out, try to explain to people climate change is a global problem, even though you might not understand the sciences behind it, but this is how it affects you as an individual in your own local community. And this is how other people are adapting, and this is how you can as well adapt or localize some of these solutions in your own community.
Thank you. Excellent answer. Thanks so much, Vivian. And I'm recognizing that we're just a little bit past halfway, and I want to get to the questions from the audience. I'm going to ask one last question of the panelists, but as I do that, I want to really encourage you to bring your questions forward. There's some excellent questions already that have been posted in the Q&A. And Jacqui, if I might ask you to migrate the good ones that are forming in chat over to the Q&A, and I'll go right off of the Q&A one if you help me organize those. Some are different questions and outreach. Some people were asking how to get in touch with us, and that's all now in the chat. Thanks to my colleague who's joined us. And if you want to reach us, please do. We'd encourage that. But before we shift to really focusing on some really great questions, last thing I want to put to the panelists is this. Steve sort of already hinted at the fact that Hibah is indeed a graduate of Columbia School of Journalism. It is also, I'm very proud to say, it's my alma mater as well. And we recruit a lot from Columbia, as well as every other university journalism program in the United States and increasingly globally that we can get. But Columbia's produced some extraordinary graduates. And Steve, it's always been on the cutting edge of thinking about the future of journalism and thinking about opportunity, especially for the next generation. I just want to hit a note here and say, we really would like to hear from you, Steve, about the opportunities for the next generation, what you see their best way to navigate a course to doing meaningful work, to be of service, to do the kind of public service work that so many want to do. How do you see that playing out with your graduates? What are you encouraging them to do?
Well, I think the young journalists who I encounter at Columbia are very idealistic, really, just as generations before in journalism have been, but they come with a sense of public purpose and a public mission. They generally don't need coaxing into that part of the motivation. I think in terms of what a graduate education must provide, can provide to help accelerate them toward the goals they've already often set for themselves, I'll just briefly mention a few things. One, it is a disrupted field, and so long mentorship in stable newsrooms is not as common an opportunity for young journalists as it used to be. And so I think graduate school becomes even more important so that young journalists can navigate their own way independently without stepping into traps that their mentors of an earlier generation might have steered them away from, whether those are ethical choices or career choices. You're on your own a little bit more, so there's a need for preparation. And so we concentrate a lot on that, just thinking about the reality that a lot of our graduates are going to be deinstitutionalized. They may work for different organizations like Hibah does now, but they're going to move around more than journalists before them did. Second big change, I think, is we all have to be aware that the structure of information and power in the world we're in now requires more computational techniques than some of us who went into journalism to get away from math might have had the capacity to handle before. But powerful choices are now being made by algorithms. Information is structured into huge data sets. That's an opportunity. It's also a requirement of us to hold the use of these of these techniques. Pegasus is a great example. We're both a target of such surveillance techniques, but we also should be reporting on them. And to do that, we need to prepare those journalists who are interested and capable for the next generation of computational reporting. And then finally, I think we all know that storytelling is enduring, but that the forms of it are constantly shifting. I think it's, there are always a lot of forecasts about exactly what form of storytelling is going to capture the next generation. There was a time recently when everyone was betting on virtual reality and that sort of thing. perhaps its day will come, but some of that turned out to be premature. I'm not sure very many people in journalism foresaw the podcasting boom. Most journalism institutions have been late to catch up with it, but it's an enormous opportunity for all kinds of journalists. Podcasting covers so many different kinds of voicings that are non-journalistic, but some of the most powerful work has been deeply reported and really brilliantly narrated. And I think that's an opportunity that we're trying to connect our students to as well.
Thanks. And Hibah and Vivian, maybe just 30 seconds, if you could, just give a really sort of crisp answer, because I really want to get to the questions from the audience. But Hibah, Vivian, how confident do you feel about your future? Do you feel like there's certainly a lot of work that needs to be done? Hibah, start with us. Start us off. Just how do you feel about the future? How confident are you?
In 30 seconds, okay. I have to say that I think the newsroom I work for has helped me feel more confident. Our founder and executive editor, Ansari Ibrahim, he's also a Columbia graduate, kind of fits that same very idealistic. He had a really, really important and crisp and amazing vision for Sahan Journal before he started it. And I think that sort of is what attracted investors and, kind of gave us our footing. But seeing just the work that we produce, it was such a small team, and at the rate we do produce, it really is what's kind of not just giving us readers, but what's sustaining our actual newsroom. And so it's really interesting for me to kind of see that again early in my career, to see how that operation works. I don't think I would have gotten that opportunity had I worked for maybe like a larger legacy newsroom. Would have learned other things, but it's really interesting again early in this career at such a time when this industry is changing so much, which I guess is kind of all the time. I really valued that. But one thing I did want to add is I really appreciate the fact that I work at a newsroom that understands at the macro and the micro level how the demographics of the nation are changing. And I think that every journalist should have the skills to be able to report that well. It's not about the numbers that the census is putting out every 10 years. Who are the people that are contributing to the population changes? What is it that they need? The challenges they face, what does that maybe say about a system or a person in power or an institution? So I feel like we need to be seeing more of that. And I think young emerging journalists of color especially kind of grasp that necessity a lot faster. But I think that is a skill that every journalist should really clean up as they move along their career.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Hibah. And Vivian, what would be just sort of your take? There's also some really good questions in here about engaging with a younger audience and the challenge for news organizations to do that. Maybe talk a little bit about your future, what your sense of the future is, Vivian, a little bit about how you think your news organization is succeeding or not in terms of reaching that younger generation, that younger audience online.
Yes, so I'm very much optimistic about my career and the sustainability of local news in Nigeria, because looking at the organization where I work, it's knowledge driven, and they do a whole lot of work trying to break the narrative in terms of getting some of these stories on the ground and not being non-partisan, non-sectional, trying to be free from that. I don't know, like that's kind of gagging of the media that the powers that be would rather want to have, So I feel that having to work with such a media is going to give me the opportunity to tell the kind of stories that I want to tell. And the opportunity that Report for the World, organizations like Report for the World has offered, also gives that opportunity to tell those stories that break the narrative. Because let's look at my beat, which is climate change. You'd see that in a place like Nigeria, stories around the environment, especially when it has to do with maybe oil, pollution, are stories that some people would rather you not tell. But with media organizations like mine and some other media organizations that are beginning to spring up, some of these narratives are breaking. Young people are trying to break some of these narratives. They are employing more young people that are energetic and know how to use the digital space to campaign for what they know is true and trying to speak truth to power. So I believe that the future of local news and my future and my career in the news industry in Nigeria is sustainable because of where I work and because of the opportunities and platforms they've offered me to be able to do the work that I do.
Okay, thank you. And I think you started to help us get an answer to this, Vivian, but this is a question from the audience specifically. It's from Amelia Ote, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But a critical question this audience member points out is how to engage millennials, Gen Z, and news sources that aren't curated by social media feeds. Do we have any tips on how to get the upcoming generations to not only read and get interested in local news, but also to be able to discern between what are trustworthy and non-trustworthy news sources? Steve and Hibah, I'd love you to both maybe take a rapid fire shot at that. Steve, you want to start, and then Hibah, we'll go to you.
Well, I think we're all called upon to, again, acquire more kind of awareness of how particularly organized propaganda and deliberately false information comes to us and how to recognize it. There are, we're now trying to teach at a fairly advanced level, certainly beyond my own skills, the techniques to interrogate posted items on social media, for example, for their metadata to try to determine, to try to identify a deliberately manufactured false news or propaganda. But also, as you all know, who, especially Charlie, with some of the work you've done, remote reporting is increasingly a part of independent professional journalism, and that requires tools of verification and that are quite distinct from those taught even 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, for example, you mentioned Afghanistan. Lots of what's happening in the country right now is very difficult to get at, even for those journalists who stayed in Kabul after the evacuation of the United States and European countries. But there are citizens around Afghanistan posting videos. There's also an enormous amount of propaganda that is polluting our understanding of what's going on in different places. And so to be the kind of journalist who can sort authentic citizen video from fake citizen video, that's a huge skill set in this day and age. And it's also relevant locally. So yeah, this is the kind of thing I think we have to all be aware of. Some of it is self-training. Some of it is taking the opportunity to renew our skills.
Thanks. And, it's a great answer, Steve. Thank you. And I'm going to take a chance with you, Hibah, and as you answer some of that question, fold in another excellent question from Caroline, because I think it touches on this, and it's really around like what is the importance of local media to work in local languages? And I think engagement in your case, Hibah, and for you, I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. To Vivian, for you to talk about some of the ways you hit local areas will be interesting. But Hibah, for you, it's a unique challenge, right? Local language, engagement, younger audiences. Help us bring those two questions together. How do we engage, and how important are local languages in the process of that engagement?
Yeah, so I don't speak Somali, I don't speak Hmong, and I'm trying to teach myself Spanish. So it's really hard for me to speak with sources in their native language if they're not fluent in English. So one way that I have been able to get around that is, if that's a barrier I'm hitting, I just ask my source, do you have a son or a daughter or a neighbor or a friend who's willing to kind of jump on this call with us and translate? And that kind of hits two birds with one stone. One, I'm able to speak to them and they're able to communicate with me. And on top of that, they also have somebody that they trust on a call with me. So they feel more comfortable, and they might feel more candid talking to a person that they trust. And sometimes it takes a little bit longer. Sometimes my recordings are really long, but it's really been the, I guess, most effective way that I've been able to get around language barrier. In terms of social media, and I guess just our multimedia content in general, we get a lot of our engagement through Twitter and Instagram. And so because of that, we've really focused on really just kind of keeping our content on social media fresh. And it's surprising to me still, I don't know why it's surprising, but even when I talk to younger people, just in my own social circles, and mention that I work for Sahan Journal, I almost always will hear something like, oh, I follow you guys on Twitter, or your Instagram is really great. And the numbers on our end really reflect that. And so that's kind of been something we're trying to focus more on. It's just kind of repackaging our stories in short Twitter threads or Instagram slides, and making sure that we're covering all our bases in terms of engagement. And we have people who are hired specifically to do that. And they work with the reporters like myself to think about how we can, again, think of a story not just as a story on our website, but as a package that can be communicated to our readers on different platforms. I grew up with the internet, I grew up with social media, but when it comes to doing all of that as a reporter and from a journalistic standpoint, that has really been a learning curve for me. And I think having people who are committed to, repackaging our stories in interesting ways has been really interesting for me to see. But I feel like the stakes for sort of the quote unquote younger generation in the communities we cover are really high, because when it comes to, a lot of the times they're the ones translating for their parents at doctor's appointments, or helping them go vote and telling them, these are the different candidates you can vote for. They're the ones driving them to the polls. So it's really important that we engage that generation so that they can communicate whatever information is needed to their parents as well. And so we make sure that we're hitting that demographic, either just in terms of getting information to them, but also engaging them as sources too, and allowing 15, 16, 17-year-old to speak freely as on an issue that they care about. But then also providing content that we feel is really necessary to get out there in native languages. So an example of that that's been really successful for us is we've been doing COVID frequently asked question videos in Somali, Hmong, and Spanish, as well as English. And so throughout the pandemic, we've just been compiling different questions that we know people have in the communities we cover, and making sure that they're getting the information they need about where they can get tested, and then where they can get vaccinated, and what are some myths about the vaccine, and what are scientists saying about it, and doing so in a way that's easy to digest, and in a way that feels like you're just talking to your parents. So that's kind of how we have tackled both of those issues, and they are really intertwined now that I think about it. Yeah.
That is really the purpose. Sorry, we're getting a little. I don't know if anyone else is hearing that. I hope that doesn't persist. But thank you. Really love the way you brought those two together. Thank you, Hibah. Well, there's a question from the audience from Manja Rule that I think I can answer pretty quickly, but I'd invite you, Steve, especially since you've been really thinking about business models. The question is an important one. It's sometimes it will be very risky to take financial support from a foreign organization for a local news project. Hostile governments may brand the journalist as a foreign paid agent. Please suggest. Really important issue and an incredibly important question. And I guess I come at this keenly aware of how tricky this is. We've done work in Egypt where we had a grant from the Ford Foundation, only to find out that the representative of the Ford Foundation in Cairo at that time then eventually got arrested by the regime. It is a really serious issue. In Myanmar, we did some some important journalism projects there right at the height of the great hope for democracy. And even amid that time of hope, which has sadly faded so greatly, I hope it comes back, but the confidence even then made it very difficult for us to operate. So I know this is an extremely challenging area, but I do think there are models for doing this. You're always going to have to be courageous about pushing back to the government if they claim you're a foreign agent, when you're really just trying to get the independent support to do independent work. The key will be for the funding to be attached to that understanding of independence. And there are really important guides for this that we have in the United States around public media. Public broadcasting in the United States has come up with some very, very clear, solid, easy to understand guidelines on how to ensure that any funder's commitment of resources to help journalism comes with no editorial control, and that we have to maintain that independence. We at GroundTruth and through our two programs, Report for America and Report for the World, we abide by those guidelines very strictly. So that's how we've dealt with it. And I hope that helps answer the question, Steve. I didn't know if you have anything to add there, but if you do, please do. But there's a question here I'm going to put to you first, because I think I don't want to miss out the chance to hear this. We only have a few minutes left. Someone was asking about, how do we cover these global issues? And the person asking the question, Emre, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, said big global issues can best be covered by well-educated journalists. Addressed to you, Steve, as top journalist and academic, how do you see the evolving relationship between the media and academia with all their changing needs and capacities? Do you think journalism students are prepared for the realities of journalism's business? The business model's changing so greatly. So maybe just try to get at that, and what change should come about, if any, in the near future around that relationship between academia and media, Steve? Let's see. Steve,
sorry. Yeah, we talked about some of it before with the rise of computational journalism, which reflects the rise of those practices in major newsrooms as well. But I think, that the graduate schools like Columbia have always faced both the profession and then the university. And by that, I mean, when we face the university, we're trying to prepare knowledge-based journalists who independently are capable of leading the newsrooms they find, not just fitting into them, and who themselves can start to think forward and imagine new models and new ways to pursue public interest journalism. So that is our core mission. At the same time, we must stay in close touch with newsrooms and serve them. The interesting thing is that so that they'll hire our graduates and recognize them as well prepared for the work that they have in mind. The thing that I find so interesting in this role, one of the things you have to do in this role is you go around and ask newsroom leaders, how are we doing? Like, what do you want from our graduates? Certainly want to know that, even if we're not going to pander to everyone. And over and over again, the enduring answer I hear is, please send me journalists who can think and write and tell stories and report on their own. Just give me people who know what a story is, where the public interest lies, and how to get at it. All of the rest of the bells and whistles, the video editing and the techniques, I can teach them that in 2 or 3 weeks. What I can't do is find people who really know what journalism is and how to do it. And I find that very heartening. I'm not, I'm surprised how often I hear that, but it does tell us that we're all in the same space, which is that there is a public purpose to this journalism. It does require reporters on the front lines to be able to do it independently and in an independent spirit. And that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. We're really at time here. We're right at the hour. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank our panelists. Outstanding job. I wish we had more time. With a nod of the head from you, Jacqui, I might just have everyone offer a quick closing remark if we have time for that. Okay, we do. Yes. So I will ask everyone to hit maybe just a closing thought. But one thought I'd share is just that local journalism is definitely in crisis. It's national and it's global, but I think that local journalism is absolutely at the center of how we come back together in terribly divided societies. I think with shared sets of facts locally, that local news, the stories of heroes and villains and accountability and just great human narratives that really pull communities together are the binding agent for us to come back. And I started in local news myself. I went on to do a lot of international reporting, but I always think of myself wherever I am and constantly trying to maybe think globally, but report locally. And I think it'll be part of us figuring this out going forward. So quick closing thought on your sense of this, that equation. Just what would you like to close on? I'll go in the order of you first, Hibah, and then we'll come right over to you, Vivian, and Steve, maybe you close us out. So Hibah, how would you, just a quick, we're all already over time, so as quick as you can, what would you like to close with?
Yeah, I think I've never felt more of an urgency to be a local reporter than I did at the start of my job at Sahan Journal. Again, I moved in a week after George Floyd was killed, and I've been here since. And so I've been here covering not just the racial reckoning that's resulted from that, but COVID, and again, the larger changing demographics of our nation and how that, what we can do to accommodate that. I feel really lucky to be here. And with that, I guess, comes a lot of responsibility, but I feel like I have a newsroom that's supportive of me and allows me to kind of do what Dean Coll is talking about, is, figure out what is the story and what's in the public interest on my own. And I feel like my education at Columbia has really prepared me for that. And my newsroom is allowing me to put that preparation into practice. So I feel really lucky, and I hope that that's the case for other people in this industry as well.
Thank you. Vivian.
All right. So on my part, I'm going to say that there is no better time to start telling local stories than now. It's a time when there are a lot of global issues going on, and the far-reaching impact of some of these issues, like climate change, which I report on, would not be able, the world can't, address some of these issues if they're not able to see what the bigger picture is. The discourse around these issues would be tailored around how it's affecting people, how it's affecting communities, how the impact is affecting the next person and myself, because even the people polluting the environment are also being impacted by some of these climate change impacts. So I feel the moment we start talking about local stories, the moment we start discussing at the local level, then the global discourse will make more sense, and there will be more activity tailored towards addressing some of these issues, because we're seeing the impact firsthand and how it's affecting people through the reporting that we do. So I believe that local journalism or local reporting is the way to go if we're to address the climate issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve, can you close us out?
I guess the last thought I have, just thinking about how we're all in agreement about how important this issue of local journalism is, but I do think that in our own field, we have some work to do to persuade young journalists to really invest their time and choose to work, as Hibah's doing, in newsrooms like the one she's placed in, because the national media, certainly in this country and in others that I'm familiar with, they've found their footing. They have jobs. There's a certain glamour of being the Washington reporter chasing members of Congress around, or just skipping the step of working in local communities, which used to be the necessary beginning of so many careers. So how do we persuade people who have a job offer in Brooklyn, where they already live with their friends and their cohort, to pick up and move to places that may seem frightening? Some of the graduates of our school seem more frightened about moving to Texas than about moving to Afghanistan. And and I understand it can feel isolating to take that journey, but Hibah, we need your help in thinking about how to communicate this because it's important. There is a public service aspect of it, but it shouldn't feel like charity. It's actually a great way to become a journalist and to do work that matters.
Yeah, we would of course, Steve, say we would invite you to answer the call to public service that's part of Report for America. And for those globally who are interested in local reporting, Report for the World, we think public service goes right through what we're trying to do. And I really, if anyone knows someone who wants to take up Steve's challenge about thinking about local reporting as this incredible commitment to service, but also the smartest way to start your career, to get out. There is no bigger story than local stories right now. I truly believe that, and really welcome anyone. That the websites are all in the chat here. We do have to close out. I want to thank you all for this, and really thank you to IPI for an excellent Congress and for putting this panel together. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And thanks, Hibah, thanks, Steve, thanks, Charlie, thanks, Vivian. It was a fabulous discussion.